Imagine, if you can, a different universe. A fictional universe completely different from our own. In this universe, there exist only inanimate objects. Wood, sticks, rocks, boulders. Sometimes they collide into each other in the ether. Ask yourself in this context if it would be possible for a morality to exist in this universe, which is composed only of inanimate matter. There are no living beings there. More specifically, there are no conscious beings. It's just inanimate matter. Sometimes inanimate matter collides against other inanimate matter, but that's it. So ask yourself, in this universe, is it possible to have morals in this context? Is it possible, more specifically, to have interests? That is to say, goals that conscious beings pursue. Now, the answer, I would think, is rather obvious, but I will, for the sake of clarity, state it nonetheless. In a universe without living beings, specifically without conscious beings, there is no morality, and there are no interests. The rock that smashes into the piece of wood doesn't feel anything, and the piece of wood that's been smashed to pieces doesn't feel anything either. Of course, all of this should be rather obvious, but I stated at the beginning of this video to illustrate several points as I move forward in describing certain phenomena and talking about certain issues. Now, there are people who believe that there is a sort of immutable morality that exists in nature akin to sort of laws of physics. This, given what I just stated, is absolute nonsense. There would be laws of physics almost without a doubt in a universe composed only of inanimate matter. There would be no moral laws. Now, when it comes to human beings, conscious beings, we are, to the best of our knowledge, the most conscious, most aware animals on the planet. We tend to enter into a host of problems because we lose sight of the bigger picture. Why did I talk about a universe inhabited by inanimate objects? Pun intended, yes, inhabited. Obviously, no one is habitating there at all because inanimate. Because that gives us a framework and a context for the nature of reality itself. Without conscious beings with interests, that is goals, and henceforth in this video I will be referring to these goals as interests, we have nothing. We do not have anything except neutrality. We have unfeeling neutrality. Now, something else that should be borne in mind that is relatively recent is the moral framework that we have and the sometimes seemingly complex interests we pursue. Remember, on planet Earth, life is a fairly recent phenomenon, and complex life is an incredibly recent phenomenon. And I would argue that conscious, that is, aware, complex life is an incredibly, incredibly recent phenomenon, probably more recent than anything else. Consider that maybe some of our hominid ancestors had some degree of awareness and consciousness akin to somewhere between maybe a modern gorilla and a modern human being. We're saying we're looking at maybe 1 million years of some awareness of things, and a much more complex awareness only a few 100,000. And before that, tens of millions, if not billions of years ago, you didn't really have any of that. You had nothing that would resemble conscious interest and conscious awareness, not of the sort that we are familiar with today. I state this in addition to describing the fictitious, inanimately inhabited universe to give you a context for understanding the way human beings operate. Many of the interests we pursue are the result of, as you may well know, subconscious drives and what I often and rather fondly refer to as autopilot. Instincts born of the conjunction of hormones and many, many millions of years of evolution that we're not really aware of, and nonetheless, these instincts give birth to human interests. Very, very potent human interests that some people, I would argue, regard as the most important things in their lives. Sex, personal ambitions, relationships, etc. All these are pursued in a modern framework, but the means by which one pursues them and the ultimate motivator, the ultimate cause, there we have ultimate versus proximate or distal versus proximate. These things go way, way back. Before there was any sort of consciousness, before there was any sort of morality, before there were well-formed interests that we could articulate using this incredible phenomenon we call human language. And what do we do with this? Well, we tend to ignore this fact. We tend to ignore that human interests, which are the age-old interests, for example, of reproduction and dealing with the opposite sex, as well as, for that matter, the human social interest, the advocacy of one political party over another, or vice versa. These are things that are age-old, presumably. They've been around for quite some time. But it's only in recent times, fairly recently, compared to the vast span of time that life has existed as in unconscious forms, that we can articulate those interests. We can think about them in all their complexity. And yet, in doing so, most often we forget, almost all the time, that the underlying mechanisms which had given birth to these interests were born into an environment without any moral flavor and without any flavor of conscious interest. That is to say, their inception was in the soup of neutrality. Specifically, let's talk about some phenomena that are recurrent in the context of the manosphere and in human life in general. Men and women's different reproductive strategies. Both men and women tend to moralize one another's reproductive strategy. Some men moralize the quality of hypergamy. They say it's evil or bad or whatever. Some women moralize the tendency of men to be polygynous, the desire for multiple partners. They characterize this as bad, evil, degenerate, immoral, etc. These differing reproductive tendencies came into existence at a time when, in all likelihood, there were no conscious creatures. The different reproductive physiologies that led to real-world consequences in the behavior of both men and women in some incredibly ancient or prehistoric pseudo-primate species, these strategies and what arose from all of this has nothing to do with morals or ethics. Remember, ethics and morals can only have a place in a well-formed conscious mind, a mind that is aware of its surroundings. And awareness, as far as we know, has not been around a long time. So the question, in a human context, because humans have invented morality and invented a codex of behavior, if you will, is it bad or good? Well, it depends on the question of for whom. Is female hypergamy bad or good? The question itself is somewhat nonsensical, at least from the perspective of nature. Women are hypergamous because of their biological reproductive physiology and the way they evolved. This was a beneficial behavior for them. That is, in a reproductive sense, reproductively beneficial. Men tend to be polygynous, and desire multiple partners because this was beneficial to them given their unique set of circumstances, reproductively speaking. Can certain forms of biologically inclined behavior be bad or good? And once again, the question depends on for whom. Yes, hypergamy can be very bad for men, but it is in itself, as an operative mechanism, something that is neutral. It was born into an atmosphere of neutrality. It has no moral quality to it. Just as the man who decides to cheat on his girlfriend with multiple females is pursuing his reproductive interest, at least in an ultimate sense, in a distal sense. I don't see any of these things as having a particular moral quality. And because of it, none of this particularly infuriates me. Yet the world is rife with a lot of anger directed towards basic human biology, just as one set of examples. In the mainstream, people get very angry about males' tendency towards polygamy, their tendency towards wanting multiple sexual partners. And in the quote-unquote red pill community, there are ascribed to hypergamy qualities of moral degeneracy and evil, none of which applies in either case. The man who cheats, I do not see as an immoral person. The female who engages in hypergamous activities, I do not see as an immoral person. These are people running on autopilot. And if a function is a function of autopilot, and I'm not arguing that all human behavioral functions are, it necessarily will be neutral because it arose at a time when there was no such thing as conscious beings and awareness of reality, not to the extent that we possess it now. Now, this doesn't just apply to human biology and reproductive strategies and behavior. This applies to pretty much everything. The question of good or bad is one that is relative. Now, people will jump out of their seats and scream at me, "You see, you're a relativist," and I am, because that is what the reality we live in dictates to me and demands of me. Reality is in some regards absolute. Gravity, the laws of gravity are absolute. But when it comes to something as variable and differentiated as human interests which can only exist in the framework and in the context of conscious beings, the origins of this consciousness we're not sure of, but it hasn't been around that long, you simply cannot speak in absolutes. You cannot speak in moral absolutes, certainly not. And the interests that people pursue can sometimes run counter to other people's interests. Is it good or bad? Well, it's pretty relative. What's worse, a dog or a cat as a pet? It's kind of a silly question, and you'll see just how silly the question is if you think about it. Well, if you like quiet and solitary animals, then probably a cat's a better pet for you. And if you like companionship and being social and having to be more attentive towards your pet, a dog is probably a better choice. All relative depending on what your desires are and what kind of person you are. Now, of course, this context dependency and relativity applies across the board to many different things, especially politics, for example. Recently, I was having a discussion with an online acquaintance about the issue of gun laws, gun control. He had a very extreme pro-gun position. I won't reveal my position just yet on this, but suffice to say, he lives in the American Midwest, in a specific context, in a relatively dangerous neighborhood, etc. And he has his perspective. I have my perspective. My perspective is not quite that simple, because I recognize that interests are relative. There is no such thing as a wrong position or a right position when it comes to these particular issues, for example. It's the question of a cat or dog. If you live in a dangerous neighborhood in some Midwestern American city, then almost certainly having a gun will be a useful thing to you. However, if you live in a rather boring and non-violent area of Europe, having a gun isn't particularly useful, and, well, you get my point. Because reality is neutral, human interests are necessarily going to be relative to the people representing those interests. And too many people are in the business of human absolutism. This is the only way to go, be it politics, gender issues, whatever. This is the way it's done. But as I stated at the outset, the universe is neutral. And without conscious beings to inhabit a universe, you're not going to have interest to begin with. And of course, a lot of this is pursued for the sake of ego. I talked a lot about that in Contented Rationalist. But we should recognize that there is no moral quality in particular to human interests outside of the moralizing that we do and the moralizing that we engage in. Now, I made this video in preparation of for a MGTOW talk I'm going to be having with a very bright guy quite soon, and we're going to be talking more about this issue and related issues. So I hope this was interesting, and I will see you guys very soon in that other context, dependent on context. Take care.